So, hello, my name is Peter Hageroth, and I will continue in Swedish a little while and then come back to English. Peter Hageroth, hej från omställningsrörelsen och från kursen ett år i omställning. Och jag vill särskilt välkomna våra kursdeltagare på det här väldigt spännande eventet. Vi ser att redan 70 personer är med nu. Så hjärtligt välkomna allihopa. Och speciellt vill jag då välkomna Stephen Barstow och Emilia som kommer presentera Stephen lite senare. Och hittills har vi väl gjort ett antal webbinarier men betydligt mindre med vår kurs. Det här är första gången vi gör ett öppet webbinar med så många människor och det är tack vare Hela Sverige ska leva som vi får låna en sån här professionell länk. Så att med det så hälsar jag välkomna till allihopa och bollar över till Emilia som då you will do the presentation in English and the rest of the conversation obviously will be in English. So I look forward to hear that. And another thing to be mentioned is that it will be recorded for those people who has not the opportunity to follow all of it. Okay, so over to you, Emilia.
Thank you, Peter, and hello and welcome everyone that are here right now. So I, together with Peter, we work with Eskilstuna's Folk High School with this course 1 year in transition, and this is an open meeting, an open Zoom meeting where we have Stephen as our lecturer and guest. Before I give the word to you, Stephen, I just want to say thanks again to Whole Sweden Shall Live that help us with this webinar. Some practical details. Unfortunately, we will not be able to see everyone, like all of you, here in the screen. But right now there's 80 participants and more are coming in. So you will, yeah, it's just the four of us and mainly, or the three of us and mainly Stephen that is seen. But you can ask questions and you do that through the chat, that you write your question in the chat and I will gather them. And mainly towards the end, there will be a room for like questions. So the time, we will end the webinar at latest just before 8, but from like 7:30, we will give space for questions, maybe even a little bit before. So that is how it looks. And as Peter said, it's also being recorded. So, Stephen, this is the second time that I'm with you in making a webinar, and it's a delight to have you again. As I understand, you come from England from the beginning, and in the early 80s, you came to Trondheim, where you live like 15 kilometers outside the town of Trondheim.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah. And since way back, a long time back, you have had a strong interest for growing your own vegetables and food and like exploring plants and how especially like ornamental plants and wild plants can be used and used in new ways and so on. And this has led, this like passion of yours has led you to that you have a garden outside Trondheim with thousands, like up to 3,000 plants, as I know. And your ability to speak about your passion and your knowledge about plants, that has like really inspired, been part of an inspiration for like an emerging like network of people that also are passionate about perennial plants and how we can build perennial food systems. And I see you as one very important mentor for that movement. So it's very nice to have you with us. So with that, I invite you to start and to share your screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Amelia. It's a really nice welcome, and welcome to everybody else here. I'll just put on my presentation, if I can do this. Whoops, just bear with me a couple of seconds. I have to share my screen. There we go. Share screen.
Now it works.
Okay. Right. Can you see my presentation?
Looks good.
Is that okay?
Yes, very clear.
You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, right. Well, let's get going. We've called the presentation "Perennial Vegetables for Resilience, Biodiversity, and Happiness," and I hope you'll understand by the end of the chat what I mean by this. I thought to start with, I'll give a brief introduction to who I am, where I'm coming from, how I got to where I am today, and before we move on to the plants and the main part of the lecture. As you mentioned, Amelia, at the start, I grew up in the UK. I studied in various places in the UK. I did a PhD in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and I was trained as an oceanographer, working with ocean waves, and I moved to Trondheim to get a job in 1981. So that's almost 40 years ago now, and I moved and have lived ever since in a small place, Malvik, which is about 17 kilometers from the center of the city of Trondheim, which is the third largest city in Norway. When I moved to Norway, I was a vegetarian, something that was really quite unusual at the time in Norway. In fact, it was 6 years before I met another vegetarian here. And and it also seemed, well, I always say that it seemed that vegetables were illegal here in Norway. There really were only a handful of vegetables in the supermarket, and people told me that one of the reasons there were so few vegetables was the summers were so cold here. It was difficult to grow vegetables. Well, what I've been doing over the last 40 years almost is to disprove that. And it seems living at 63.5 degrees north, what some people consider to be the Arctic, it would really wouldn't seem possible to grow. Well, I've grown something like 8,000 different edible plants in my garden over the last over these years. Okay, let's see. What you see in front of you is one of my multi-species salads, which was inspired by, I guess you've all heard of the Mediterranean diet. About 20, 30 years ago, scientists found out that old people living in the mountain villages of the Mediterranean countries like Italy and Greece and Spain, they had very low levels of cardiovascular disease. And scientists working on the interrelation between people and plants, ethnobotanists, got money to find out what the hell these people have been eating to make themselves so healthy. And just over those last 30 years, they've discovered getting on for 4,000 species of plants which were used for food just in the Mediterranean countries. Huge diversity. And not only that, they also discovered that in the springtime, there are many examples of what we can call multi-species dishes. There were salads, there were soups, there were pasta dishes, there were pizza type dishes, often with over 50 different vegetables in them, huge diversity. And this really inspired me. Was around about the early 2000s. I have something called collectomania, I should say straight off. My dad collects stamps. I had to collect something, and it ended up being edible plants. And that was based on, I started collecting edible plants. I got interested in foraging for food in the 80s when I first moved to Norway to supplement the few plants that were available in the supermarket. And I traveled around the world as with my work, and I started getting interested in foraging in other parts of the world. And I started buying up books, and we'll see a couple of them shortly. But I learned that there were literally thousands and thousands of edible plants around the world, many of which actually turned out to be what we would call ornamental plants, plants that we grow purely for looking at. And I inherited I bought a garden which the previous owners had cultivated for ornamental plants. And I found out through the literature from around the world that many of these plants were really good food plants in addition to being ornamental. Okay, let's get on to the first slide, if this works. You may notice that I have 3 letters after my name, ESM. They call me also the Extreme Salad Man because I made a salad back in 2003 with 537 different edible ingredients. And as far as I know, that's never been beaten to that day. These are a few salads that I made over the years. These have no more than about 100, 120 different edible plants. I have my own diet. 80 a day keeps the doctor away, again inspired by the Mediterranean diet. And together with some friends, a few years ago, we made a pesto with 230 different types of alliums. And we've also made a ferment with 412 different plants. My biggest edible flower salad was a salad we made a few years ago with 115 different edible flowers. And I also made a Christmas, what I call tubasmagoria. It was a Christmas together with a nut roast we made for Christmas dinner. We roasted 25 different tubers. So that's just a brief introduction. This is where I'm coming from. I'm a bit crazy with food. But I live in this place, as I mentioned, near to the city of Trondheim, just to give you some kind of geographical idea of where I'm living. 63.5 degrees north, the Arctic Circle. Can you see my pointer, by the way, Emilia?
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, okay. So the Arctic Circle's up here somewhere. I'm living here in Trondheim. Small town called Malvik, which is on the Trondheim Fjord, which is actually Norway's biggest fjord volume-wise. So the fjord represents a large volume of, in the winter, heat, because the fjord never freezes. The temperature doesn't normally go down to less than about 6 centigrade in the winter. So in the winter, the fjord represents heat. In the summer, the water is colder than the land, so it cools down. So we have cool summers and relatively mild winters. So the minimum temperature would be around about -24. In recent years, -10, -15 has been the kind of coldest during the winter. And this winter and last winter, we've been able to dig the soil more or less all winter. So again, we're seeing these big changes from year to year in the climate, sadly. Yeah, so that's that. It's just a few pictures of the garden to give you an idea of where I'm living. When I moved here, when I was living in Edinburgh, I became interested in kind of alternative things. We were kind of marching against nuclear power stations. We were concerned about something called climate change, you may be heard of. And we also, I also became a vegetarian, as I mentioned, got into whole foods, these kind of things. And can you hear me, by the way? I got a message up here saying that my internet was unstable.
I hear you very well.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, and I got interested in nature, started working on doing voluntary work on nature reserves during the weekends. Got interested in trying to learn different birds and butterflies and insects and flowers and things like this in nature. And I became very interested in birds. So by the time I moved to Trondheim, I was, my main interest was probably birds. Plants was an interest that was growing at that time. This is 1981. And so when it came to us to wanting to buy a house, I wanted a house that was also good for the birds. So we bought this house in Malvik, where there were a lot of trees. It was a very shady garden, a very hilly garden, not a natural garden that where you would think to grow vegetables. It's basically a rocky hill, quite exposed. As I said, very shady, but with a fantastic view over the fjord, as you can see in the bottom left here. So the first years I started, there was very little flat land. I'd learned that to grow vegetables, it should be flat. Ironically, today, the steepest part of my garden, which is below the house down here, is actually the most productive. I spend a lot of time trying to create terraces to make, so building walls to make more flat land for growing vegetables. But today, actually, it's down here on the slope, which is the most productive. It's an area that permaculturists who started visiting me in the mid-2000s after I started writing in Permaculture magazine in the UK, started visiting my garden and said, well, you've got a forest garden here. Or have I? I said, well, of course I had, because I'd planted practically only edible plants, and there was a mixture of different trees and shrubs, and they were all planted according to where they would grow in nature. So I'd created in some way, kind of accidentally, what today is known as a forest garden. Okay. It's also a permaculture land centre today since last year, which is a network of demonstration sites for permaculture, also known as the edible garden. This is a picture taken in the steepest slope of my garden. Here's me next to one of my largest vegetables, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. And here you can see quite clearly the structure in a forest garden with tall trees at the top, different layers. This is my largest. To go back, how do we do that? This is my largest perennial vegetable, as I mentioned, as we will come back to later. This is apple trees. There are nut trees in this area as well. This is ostrich fern. There are berry bushes. And down here at ground level, there are also a number of different edible plants that come in the early spring. Okay, 2 years ago, I took early retirement from my work as an oceanographer. Because people at work told me that you should be really working with plants. That's your main love, and they were absolutely right. So I took early retirement, and within a few weeks of taking retirement, I was actually offered an office at the Botanical Garden in Trondheim, because I'd been working for the Norwegian Genetic Resource Centre collecting old Norwegian vegetables from all over the country, mainly perennials, and many of them were onions. And we got funding to develop an onion garden at the Botanics in Trondheim. So the last couple of years I've been developing this garden. Currently it has over 300 different onions, all of which are edible, and all of which are perennials. But that's a whole separate lecture, so I won't say too much about that, apart from the fact to mention that onions are both edible. Many of them are ornamentals as well. They look good as well as tasting good, and many of them are really good for the bees as well. So plants which which combine the edible and the ornamental part, I call edimentals. Edimentals.com is also my website. And plants which combine edibility, that they're edible, they're good for the insects, entomology, ento and mental, are even better, of course. Plants which are good for nature and also for us. So I call those edientomentals. 5 years ago now, my book Around the World in 80 Plants was published. The front of the book is shows a view from my garden with one of my multi-species salads, and the book basically describes my favorite 80 perennial vegetables which I've grown up here in my garden. And I basically tell each plant in some ways has a geographical location associated with it. It's either where it grew in the wild or there's an interesting story associated with it. So I start each plant profile with some kind of story, and then I talk about how the plants were used traditionally in different parts of the world. The book is sprinkled with recipes, and it also explains how you can cultivate these plants and also how you can source these plants from nurseries, etc. I do sell on the net through my website if anybody's interested in a signed copy. But the book, as I mentioned, and the talk, is normally I take you on a journey around the world, following the stories associated with these plants. Today, I'm going to do a kind of a shortened version of this. The whole talk takes about 8 hours, as we only have an hour and a half. I've selected a number of plants to talk to today about from different parts of the world, and we'll start today in the Far East, in Japan, Korea, and China, and then we'll cross over to South America, North America, and then across to Europe, and ending up in and the Mediterranean countries, the Caucasus, the Himalaya, and ending up in Siberia, if we get that far. Okay, so let's start then with Japan and Korea and China, and particularly in Japan. This is an area of the world that where many of our ornamental plants come from. In particularly, Japan is one of the world's what we call biodiversity hotspots, with almost 2,000 plants which are only found in Japan, endemic plants. And many of these, as I've mentioned, we already grow as ornamentals, and I'll show a selection of these in a minute. And in addition to that, in Japan, Korea, and China, they have rich foraging traditions, very important in the past, from which we can get inspiration. And today, having studied, I did a study last year of the Norwegian, all the plants which have been found in Norway. There's something like 3,000 plants, which are both natives and also introduced plants, and discovered that about 40% of those plants have actually been used for food somewhere in the world. So a huge percentage of all the plants in the world are actually have been used for food. Some of them are what I describe as the emergency food category, plants you would only eat if you were in a really bad state. But many of them are really tasty as well. So from the 2,000 endemic plants in Japan, maybe 600 of them are actually, or more than that, are edible as well. So there's a huge selection that we can make from that. And the first plant that I'm going to talk about this evening is a kind of a superstar of the ornamental plants in the world. And it often surprises people that actually it's a superstar of the perennial edible world, and it's hosta. Probably the most used Orfunkia. You just notice that I've added these Swedish names in red. At least I think I got through 2/3 of the way through this lecture, adding the Swedish names for those from Sweden. But otherwise, it's in English, or in this case, tugabishi is the Japanese word for this particular species of hosta. And there are about 20 species of hosta in Japan and the Far East, and as far as I know, all of them can be eaten. There are no known toxic substances in hostas, and it's the young shoots which are used in the springtime. Normally, before the leaves start folding out, but you can also use the young leaves after they've folded or flattened out, cooked. But the young shoots, they can be used to both as a salad crop, but also as a type of spinach. You can also use the flowers and the flower buds. And in Japan, they blanch the shoots of hosta in greenhouses, darkened greenhouses. In a garden, you can just put a black pot over them in the springtime. Blanching just basically removes the sunlight, so they're much lighter coloured when the shoots come up. In Japan, they call these blanched shoots, literally translated as hosta icicles. So they look a bit like icicles hanging down, and they're almost white. On the right-hand side here is the first hosta dish I made for the family, which was basically you just very quickly cook the young leaves, and then you add a simple dressing. In this case, it was sesame oil, roasted sesame seeds, and soy sauce. Very simple, from garden to table. The flower shoots can also be eaten. They're very crispy tasting, hardly any fiber in them. It took me quite a few years to get the courage up to eat hosta. I knew nobody else in Europe that had tried it, despite the fact there had been written many books about Asiatic vegetables. Somehow hosta had been totally missed by the various authors who wrote about these. And it wasn't until I think my article about, which was titled The Oriental Spinach, in Permaculture magazine in about 2006, I think it was, that this was discussed in Europe. So I maybe was one of the first to eat hosta. And what encouraged me to try it was that although I'd read that hosta was cultivated in Japan as a vegetable and was a cash crop, was also harvested from the wild, it was foraged. it wasn't until and a few reports I noticed referenced the fact that hosta was a bit bitter tasting. So I became a bit suspicious, and I knew nothing about the chemistry of hostas or anything like that. And it wasn't until in North America they have a North American Hosta Society, which is dedicated to the genus Hosta. And there are literally 10,000 different cultivars of hosta that hosta growers have in their gardens and grow mainly as an ornamental, as I say, and some. And every year, this Hosta Society had an annual meeting. And I found their website, and there was a report from their annual meeting where in that particular year, one of their members knew about eating hosta. And they'd made they had a big annual dinner, and they made a number of hosta dishes for the participants. And after the event, the various participants were invited to comment on this on the website. So I read all the comments, and all the comments were really positive. Well, you know, people were really surprised how tasty this vegetable was, and you know, it wasn't bitter at all. It tasted as good as spinach. These kind of comments. So that really encouraged me to finally take the plunge and make a hosta dish. And I was inspired by some of the recipes from that big dinner. But before I go on, in the hosta,
Stephen?
Yeah.
Just there is a question coming up here.
Yep, sure.
From Sanya. How much can you harvest from a hosta plant each year? What's your view of that?
Well, I've never tried to kill a hosta plant. I think it's almost impossible to kill a hosta. But I've taken all the young shoots in the springtime, and it resprouts, and it will flower in the same year. But I haven't tried to take all the shoots every year. But I know that various hosta growers who grow them for ornamentals deliberately cut off all the shoots, all the leaves after maybe it's growing for a couple of months for the new leaves that come, because hostas are mainly grown for the leaves. So some hosta growers deliberately cut all the shoots every year. But it's a question of really the soil you're growing on. I suspect that under my conditions, I could take all the shoots once every year, and it would still be okay. But other conditions could be different, so I can't really give a definite answer there. Many perennial crops, we talk about maybe taking every other shoot or something like that. But I think with hosta, you could take potentially more than that. And it also turns out that hosta are very nutritious. There's a couple of reports from Japan which suggest that hosta is more nutritious actually than spinach, which also surprises people, because hosta is a plant which loves growing in shady conditions. So my biggest hosta plants are on the north side of my house, a place that I wouldn't dream of growing annual vegetables. And the picture in front of you here is in that woodland that you can see here is one of the national collections of large-leaved hostas in the UK. And so in that forest there is a huge amount of food. And when I wrote the article in Permaculture magazine, I joked that the owner of this garden, who is Prince Charles, this is Highgrove, had the most productive forest garden in the UK, just that he didn't know about it yet. I wrote to him on his, he's got a web page where you can send him messages. So I sent him a message telling him that he had the most productive forest garden in the UK, but he didn't answer. But a few years later, I was invited to give a talk to the UK Walled Garden Symposium at a big house in south west England. Now, this was a collection of gardeners who work at who were gardeners in the big houses in the UK. And I showed this slide here. Little did I know that two of Prince Charles's head gardeners were in the front row in front of me. And afterwards they came up to me and said, we had no idea that hosta was edible. That's really interesting. So I very quickly took a copy of my book and signed it to HRH Prince Charles. Please give a copy to the Prince. He'd be interested in this. And that winter, actually, the Prince's private secretary contacted me, and it ended up with me being invited to Highgrove to see this national collection. Unfortunately, the Prince didn't turn up. He had a bad excuse that his mother had a birthday. Anyway, I digress. So this is a picture within Prince Charles's national collection. It's called the what's it called? The stubbery. So these old dead wood lying around everywhere with these enormous hosta plants between them. A place you wouldn't think there would be food in this kind of environment. In Japan, this is what you can buy from the supermarket, these hosta icicles, or forced blanched shoots. And they were used, and this is a couple of pictures from which we discovered just this week from a Facebook page of a Japanese hosta grower, where they're they're forcing the hosta in greenhouses in the spring for these young sprouts that you can see on the left-hand side there. So it seems that they grow the hosta on a field scale like this, and they then dig up the entire hosta plant. So there were pictures on their page of all these huge big mounds of hosta plants, these big herbaceous perennials, which are then moved into these greenhouses, and they're covered, the roots are covered with maybe 10-20 centimeters of rice husks to eliminate the sunlight from the emerging shoots. So they're blanched in that way.
We have another question regarding hostas. Do you know if there are any restrictions concerning the amount you can eat of hostas?
No, I've never come across any toxic substances in. So I think you could use hosta as you would spinach or any other. I mean, you can overdose on anything. But if you follow my diet, 80 a day keeps the doctor away, then diversity, then you won't get sick. You have to, so you'd never have a huge amount of anything. So moderation is the word I'm thinking of. Just a couple of ways they use hosta. This is basically one of the dishes that was made at this big hosta symposium in the US. It's they called it hosta capita. It was actually the same recipe as Greek spinach pie. So you just replace the spinach with hosta leaves instead. Hosta capita or spanakopita is the spinach variant. On the right-hand side, my daughter was really interested in making sushi over a period, and we found a recipe for hosta sushi. Actually, the large leaves of hosta can also be used as a kind of a wrap around food. Again, an edible wrap. But in this case, the hosta was used inside the sushi, cooked for about 5 minutes. Okay, well, this brings us on. Hosta is a very good example I'd just like to talk a little bit about the advantages and why we should be growing more perennials in the future. So I've just listed up a number of advantages, and actually hosta, I take this after hosta because most of these fit hosta really well. First of all, perennials are growing most actively in the early spring. So from in my area, it's from April until the middle of June, the end of June. That's the most active growing season. And at that time of year, at least in my climate, there are almost no insects and other like fungal diseases. So it's much easier to grow these perennials organically. Perennials have less water requirements. Just put my pointer here. They need less water requirements or irrigation, as there's usually enough water in that springtime period when the plants are growing most actively after a long winter. So they're much more robust against extreme conditions such as droughts and large changes in the climate due to climate change. There's also, and part of the reason for this, not only the fact they're growing in the springtime, but also the root system is much more, is much bigger than annuals, and it's already developed in the springtime. So they're much more efficient at absorbing the available water in the soil. And the same applies to fertilizer. Actually, I never fertilize any of my perennials. My soil is a very fertile soil, but I can harvest on a regular basis without actually adding any fertilizer. Again, the roots being already developed in the springtime and much bigger root mass, then they're much more efficient at bringing up the available fertilizer that nature brings with it, both from above and from the source rock below. Perennials are like the ultimate no-dig gardening. Okay, you sow the seed or you plant the plant, and then you can generally harvest for many years afterwards. My oldest perennial is a sea kale, which I planted actually in 1983, and it still provides food every year. So after 38 years or so. So one doesn't have to sow seed and plant every year, so it's less work. It's not no work. You still have to manage the plants and stop aggressive weeds coming in. But it's the ultimate no-dig gardening, and it's easier than, I mean, no-dig gardening. I started no-dig gardening some years ago, but it was actually accessing all the mulching material was not that simple. Took a lot of time, and I just didn't have the land available to provide that. Anyway, less energy. They also so also on a farm scale, obviously, less need for fossil fuels. And it turns out that these perennial vegetables are as good or often better than traditional vegetables nutritionally. And this also applies to wild plants. So, whoops, sorry. Let's see. If not anything else, perennials complement traditional vegetables. It's mainly a spring harvest, okay? Although perennials, the season for harvesting perennials, there are various techniques for extending that season. And many perennials actually have a new flush of young leaves in the autumn. For example, nettles do this. But they can complement traditional vegetables. And this then decreases the need to import food during what was in the past called the hungry gap. So people that forage are actually doing a similar thing. It's usually perennials they're harvesting as well. And this also reduces the need for plastics, e.g. We use a lot of floating row covers, you know, agril and things like this, and polytunnels and cloches, often made of plastics. These are used to extend the season for the same annuals that we're harvesting a bit later in the season. Using perennials, we don't need to do that because these are plants which are adapted to growing in the very early spring under cold conditions. And I'll explain that in a minute. Perennials sequester more, they store more carbon in the soil, and they also reduce erosion, two things which there are big problems with in some parts of the world. Many species grow best, actually, like hosta, in shady conditions and are suitable for these edible forest gardens, which have become very popular within permaculture, etc. And they're also perfect for urban areas. Urban areas tend to have very tall buildings and a lot of shade, and so they're perfect for that kind of condition as well. Not only shady conditions, like hosta again is a plant which both grows in the forest but also grows in the alpine meadows where it's very sunny. So they're very adaptable plants. So perennials, we should be growing more perennials also on rooftop gardens, for example, for the same reason that they're storing more carbon over the whole year. Another thing is, as I've already mentioned, is this thing of that many of these perennials double as ornamental plants. So you can just forget growing ornamental plants and just grow perennial, what I call edimentals. And many are excellent pollinator plants. We've talked about that. And they're particularly advantageous in areas with short seasons. I'm thinking of mountain areas, the Arctic, the Alps, these kind of areas where it's difficult to grow traditional annual plants because they take a lot of time getting going in the springtime, and it's not until perhaps July they're really starting to grow, and then maybe in August or September you're getting the first frosts. Perennials are much more robust against that under these kind of conditions. We have various experiments now ongoing in our Norwegian seed saver organization, where we're establishing plots in the mountains to test perennials under these conditions. Okay, so that's a number of the advantages. What's not to love about them, and particularly when you're growing in a forest garden type setting, which I'm lucky enough myself to have established. Then we're happy, and the plants are happy, the insects are happy, and the planet's happy. For those of you who don't know what a forest garden is, I'm not going to talk at length about this, but just this is the classic illustration by Graham Burnett showing how a forest garden can be structured with edible plants, medicinal plants, various other useful plants in different layers. You've got the large trees at the top, like nut trees, walnuts, for example, chestnuts, etc. Smaller trees like apples and pears and things like that. You've got currant bushes down here. What I'm talking about mainly here today are the herbaceous perennials. Not all of them are forest plants, but most of them are. And many of them are also climbing plants, which climb up into the trees. Okay, let's go on. So my second plant from Japan is this one here. It's my largest herbaceous perennial. I've already shown it. It's in the ginseng family, Udo. This picture here is interesting because it was taken in the middle of June, about, I think, 4 years ago. in the coldest spring my area had ever experienced after 250 years or so of meteorological measurements. It was the coldest spring ever. Right up until the middle of June, we hadn't had a single day where the temperature had exceeded 17 degrees centigrade. Okay, which is cold. And traditional farmers who are growing, they mainly grow corn, not corn, I mean grains in this area, were complaining that it was probably going to be a catastrophic year because they still hadn't managed to get out and plough their fields because of the low temperatures. At the same time, all the way from the beginning of April in that particular year, there had not been a single day, a single frost. Now the thing is that in my area, because I'm so far north, by the middle of June, by the beginning of May, we have no night. We have very long days. We lose the stars for about 3 months in the summer. And because there's no night, the temperature is more or less the same over the whole day. So the temperature doesn't drop in the middle of the night and get frosts. So by May, we just don't have frosts here. Whereas like my parents, they're still both alive and they live in southern England. Every other year, they lose all their fruit, plums and things like that to late frosts. We never experienced late frosts here, so we always get a crop of plums and apples and things like that. So in this year, in this particular year I'm talking about here, we had no frost from the beginning of April until the middle of June, but we had very low temperatures. Now this was absolutely ideal conditions for perennial vegetables, because perennial vegetables are mainly, as I've mentioned, forest plants, and they're adapted to growing very early in the spring before the leaves start appearing on the trees. Okay, so they're adapted to these low temperatures naturally. So leaf production was the biggest I'd ever experienced in my area in the coldest spring ever. Okay, which sounds a bit, but it's the opposite of annuals. Perennials are much more robust to this kind of to low temperatures, and it was also, and part of the reason was the fact that it was too cold for flowers to start appearing on these plants. Often when perennials start flowering, they produce less leaf. Okay, so in this particular year, it was too cold. There was no point for the flowers to appear when there were too few insects around because of the low temperatures. So we've got the biggest crops ever in the coldest spring ever. Anyway, this is a little bit more about this one here. It's actually in Japan, the young shoots are harvested up to about 1 meter high in the springtime, and there's so-called green udo, which is just harvested as is, and the blanched white udo. This is white udo from my garden, where I've basically had one of these very big buckets you can get for mixing cement or whatever, put over the roots in the very early spring before the shoots appear. And then you just watch that bucket, and when the plant throws the bucket off the plant, which happens every year, and it starts rolling down my slope, because this plant is actually growing on the steepest slope in my garden, it's ready to harvest. And you basically just cut these shoots, you peel off the outside layer, which is slightly, you can see it's slightly hairy and slightly fibrous-y. And once you've done that, you just dice them into these small sections and add again, they used kind of a sesame soy sauce dressing in Japan. And then you eat. Then you have a salad direct from the garden to table. You could do this in about 20 minutes. It's what I call fast, slow food, and it's delicious. There are many other ways of using it. You don't, both as a salad and as a cooked, kind of like an asparagus in various dishes. It's also the flower shoots just before the flowers open are often used in what's it called now? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah, okay. 3-4 years ago, I was invited to go on a kind of a study tour to, because in Japan, they've, like everywhere in the world, the cities are getting bigger and the countryside's becoming less and less people living in the mountain villages, etc. And in Japan, this is particularly extreme. The mountain villages are becoming depopulated. And the people that originate from these mountain villages and remember the really good, tasty food that they forage from nature, there's a demand, they're demanding this food. So there's a whole industry that's started up in Japan in producing what they call sansai. Sansai literally means mountain vegetables that were originally brought down from the mountain, but which are nowadays cultivated around the big cities in farms. And one of them is this udo, Aurelia cordata. And I'd read about this tradition of growing udo in underground caverns in the middle of Tokyo. And I had to experience this, and luckily, thanks to various friends, we were put in contact with a farmer who agreed to that we could come and visit, and we had a tour around this farm. And it's basically, it turned out to be in a woodland. They had all these holes in the ground, and you could climb down a ladder down into a cavern where the roots of this large herbaceous plant had been moved. So they're grown on the farm, and then they're moved down into these caverns on maybe every year or so, and the young shoots that are harvested. And these underground caverns were had a very stable temperature, so that it was very controllable. The product was very nicely controlled. So this gave the highest quality of white udo in Japan. And it was really fascinating to see this. And these underground caverns have been operated for more or less 100 years at least. And the farmer told us that we were the first Europeans that had asked to come and see this fantastic cultivation. The green udo is often used with tempura. This is tempura here. Tempura is, it's where the vegetables are coated with a kind of a flour pancake batter, lightly coated and then deep fried. And this is kind of street food in Japan, and there are restaurants just selling tempura, and often sansai or wild food. And it's often the strongest tasting herbs which are used in tempura, because the oil and the batter basically coats your tongue so that you don't detect the bitterness as strongly. And green udo is quite strong tasting. That's why I think for us Europeans, the white udo is more acceptable, although in tempura it was perfectly fine.
Like a question?
Yeah, sure.
Do they bring the udo back to the farm afterwards?
Yeah, they. It was a bit unclear, but they had many of the plants. Some of them were moved back onto the land, but they didn't need all of them. In fact, the roots of udo were also used as an alternative to ginseng in the past. So they would take a few of the plants back and plant them on the land again, and then they would get bigger over a year or two, and then they'd harvest them again. but the other roots they would sell as an alternative to ginseng. But when we were at the farm, the farmer explained that unfortunately the market for this alternative ginseng had dried up, and they were unable to sell it. So there were mounds, big mounds of Udo roots next to these forcing caverns. Okay. Yeah, this is just a picture of what I call an edimental border. You can have food and ornament in the same place. This is the most commonly available Udo, Aurelia caudatus sunking it's called. But it seems to be a much smaller plant than the wild plant, or the ones which are being used for food in Japan. I haven't had a chance yet to try this one, but it seems to give a lower yield than the other one, so probably not as good. And here again, together with hosta, you can see. Another plant in the Aurelia genus, Aurelia lata, a plant we call devil's walking stick. We call it Fandens spaserstock in Norwegian, or devil's, also similar in Sweden, as you can see, or Park Aralia it's called. It's called devil's walking stick because when it's it's actually a young tree rather than a herbaceous perennial. And when it's a young tree, it has a stalk covered in these quite vicious looking spines. And this is a really nice tree to have in a forest garden. It never gets very big. It doesn't really shade out other plants that much. And you can harvest the young shoots or the young leaves in the springtime, which are again often used in tempura and many other dishes. In English, it's called angelica tree. So we have devils and angels in the same plant. This is actually Udo, the very young shoots, very early in the spring, which are also sometimes used in a similar way. In Japan, you see this, the Aurelia elata, they call it taranomi in Japan. The young shoots are a very important spring vegetable and available in all the supermarkets, along with Udo that we just talked about. So two very important plants. A third one, now we're in Korea, is actually an aster scaber. It's a fantastic spring vegetable. You harvest the young leaves at about this stage, as you can see, and they're used both raw in salads and also cooked in various dishes. In Korea, this is a very important exported vegetable. So popular amongst the Koreans that there's a big demand in Korean supermarkets in North America, etc., for these young shoots, which are grown for year-round production. What they do is they store the roots in a cold storage until they're ready to force them. So there's so they can produce the young shoots throughout the season, not just in the springtime. And these shoots then are harvested and dried and then exported to North America. But it's also one of the most beautiful ornamental plants in my autumn garden. So I can harvest all the young leaves and it will still produce the flowers in the autumn. So again, you can have both. What does it taste like? Well, it's not bitter. It has an aster taste, and you have to try it to. I can't read. It's kind of a slightly flowery taste or something like that. It's aromatic. Is the word. And about getting on for 6-7 years ago, a Korean woman living in Oslo. She'd lived in Oslo for I think 40 years or more. Had just recently retired, and she sent me a message because that year every year I make a seed list, which I put on the internet. It's on my webpage, which I use to trade with other people to get other plants that I need, and also through the Norwegian Seed Saver organization. That year I had seed of this plant on my seed list, and it's quite difficult to get. It took me many years before I managed to get seed of this. She contacted me because she'd been trying, she really wanted to grow this plant in her new garden that she just recently got. And she remembered foraging for this plant with her grandmother when she was 10 years old. And she still remembered the really good taste of this plant. And she really wanted to experience this once again. So I thought it was a really nice story. So I sent her some seed, and she was so happy that she knitted these socks for me, which was the best trade I've ever done. There are other asters around the world which are used for food. Not all asters can be thought of as edible. It's mainly the large-leaved asters which are used. We have one on our coastlines in Norway, and I think also in the Baltic. Sea aster, Aster tripolium, or Tripolium vulgare, I think it's called today, or strand asters in Sweden. And the young leaves of this plant are actually, it basically grows on the outer coast, where the seaweed washes up, where it's a lot of nutrients. It's a plant which tolerates high salt conditions, and is nowadays actually cultivated as a vegetable, as a gourmet crop, both in the Netherlands. It's grown in Mexico and other countries where they actually have problems with high salt content in the soils. It's another story. And the Native American vegetable big leaf aster from eastern North America, Aster macrophyllum, is another example used by native peoples around the world. Also
Stephen,
from Korea. Yeah.
A question?
Yep.
Can you eat all asters?
As far as I know, none of them are. Yeah, some of them can be a bit bitter and can contain some substances, at least within the aster family. Nowadays, what was the genus Aster is split up into many different genera, so we have to be a wee bit careful here. But I'm actually quite careful and only eat plants which are quite widely used by native peoples around the world. So I certainly wouldn't eat all asters, no. This is another plant which many people in our part of the world would think of mainly as an ornamental, Ligularia. This is a particular species of Ligularia, and I'll say now that I would only eat this particular species. There are documented other species of Ligularia which are used, and there are many other species of Ligularia which are used which are cultivated as ornamental plants around the world. But this particular one here, Ligularia fisheri, is a wild plant. It grows in the wild from the Far East to the Himalayas. It's one of the most widespread, or the most widespread Ligularia in the world. And throughout where it is found in the wild, it has been domesticated or wild foraged for food. And this Korean woman who I just mentioned a few minutes ago, she helped me to buy seed of this particular species from a vegetable catalogue in Korea. And for a perennial, this is a very fast-growing plant. The plants we could see flowering here reached flowering stage within 2 years from seed. Some perennials maybe take 3 or 4 years before they flower. And I was very surprised that the taste of these young shoots here were really mild. They're used in Korea as a salad crop in addition to as a spinach. So it was very fast growing, very productive perennial plant, which was also beautiful when it was in flower. It's called gomtree in Korea. It's also a woodland plant, which was originally foraged in, so it's a perfect plant for a forest garden. These are a few pictures from from greenhouse production of gomtree in Korea, where it's a very important crop for the markets. And bottom left, you'll see the next picture on the right-hand side that these have been collected as wraps that they use around food. And in Korea, they always eat the wrap in addition to the food inside. And at the top, you can see that this is nutritious. It's basically a spinach made from this plant with a few spices, etc. So fantastic edimental and edible plant. I've also included the mallows, katost, malva in this part of the talk because up until about 1,000 years ago, the main vegetables in China seem to have been mallows rather than brassicas, because the brassicas came from originally the wild species that the huge diversity of brassicas we get in the cabbage family we see in the Far East today derive from wild species which originated from Europe. So before 1,000 years ago, when these wild species arrived in the Far East and they began selecting them, it was actually the malvas that were, we know there were a big range of malva, red-leaved varieties, curly-leaved varieties, etc. But most of those have sadly disappeared because the brassicas tended to outcompete all the malvas. But these are some of my favorite perennial vegetables for many reasons. You can read a lot about it in the book. But unlike many perennials, this is in particular Malva moschata, the musk mallow, is a plant that is reliably perennial in my climate, and it also produces leaves for an extended season over most of the summer. You can take a few leaves over a long time rather than all the leaves in the springtime, if you see what I mean. And you can also use the unopened flower clusters, and the flowers are delicious in salads, etc. So perfect perennial. I better get on. Daylilies are documented several thousand years ago being used for food in China. One of the oldest vegetables in the world. Both the young shoots, and in particular the flower buds are delicious in stir-fry dishes. The flowers can be used, but don't eat a lot of daylily flowers raw because you get a bad stomach from it. But in moderation, there just a few on a salad is perfectly okay. And cooked, and they also harvest the flowers after they've died, because the flowers tend to open for a day or two and then they wither, and they collect the withered flowers and they dry them, and then they would be used as a kind of an ingredient in winter soups. Golden needles, they call them in Chinese supermarkets. This is a Taiwanese daylily farm. This could be anywhere in Scandinavia. If we really wanted to, we could be growing daylilies on a farm scale here too, because they're perfectly hardy throughout Scandinavia. Daylilies, again, there are a huge variety of cultivars. I tend to advise to keep to the older varieties. The Chinese tend to grow these simple yellow flowered ones, in particular the ones with rather long flowers. And there are a number of different Hemerocalis daylily species, which you can grow. And if you grow a number of different species, you can actually have flowering daylilies throughout the season from May until the autumn. So I have 5 or 6 different species in my garden. So there's always daylilies available in the summer. Okay. This is from the Botanical Garden in Oslo, where they put out snacks for the public. And in Japan, this is how daylily grows as a kind of an in the forest here, together with bamboo and a few other things. So these green shoots here, the young shoots of daylily, which they use. Okay, let's. What's the time now? Oh dear, we've got 15 minutes left. Is that right? South America.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
More or less, you could continue a little bit more, but they do have some questions also waiting for you.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I'll hurry along here. Yeah. South America isn't. There are not many leafy green vegetables that are known. It's mainly known for this fantastic diversity of root crops, like uluco and mashu and oca and potato, of course, etc. But there is one South American leafy vegetable, if you like, which is really important in Chile, and you'll see it in all the botanical gardens in over most of Europe, at least in the warmer parts of Europe. This is Gunera, Gunera tinctoria in particular. You'll see bundles of these leaf stalks on markets in Chile. It was an important food for the native people, and it's also an ingredient in the national dish of Chile, which is a kind of a meat and fish soup, and it also includes these stalks, which are often just eaten raw. They're just peeled. That has a slightly sour taste. It's often confused with rhubarb, also in Chile, and they would basically just eat it as it's very thirst quenching. Often just dipped in salt, like some people dip celery in salt. They would use these. Again, this is a plant which is very adaptable. It needs sufficient water, often planted next to lakes in the botanical gardens in Europe. But it's very adaptable. They can grow in woodlands, very little sunshine in the summer, and also in totally open areas. Gunera. I enjoy doing walks and talks in botanical gardens. This was in the Bergen, Norway Botanical Garden, where I noticed there was a group with me, and we were talking about all the edible plants in their collection, mainly perennials. And I saw this Gunera, and so I asked the member of staff from the garden whether we could have a taste, and she said, "Yeah, why not?" So we did this. So we cut off a stalk, and the people on the tour all had a little taste, and this was in September, quite late in the season. We were very surprised that actually the leaf stalk tasted actually quite sweet, which I haven't noticed on my own plants in my own garden. And this is showing another use for as an umbrella.
I have a couple of questions. First, isn't Gunera listed as an invasive plant by the EU?
Yes, that's a very important point. In parts of the EU, in Ireland in particular, and in New Zealand, I know it's become quite a troublesome weed. But really, they should be getting out there and harvesting it on a big scale rather than spraying Roundup. But yeah, you should be careful where if you're in one of these areas where it could be a potential invasive, then certainly don't plant it. But in Scandinavia,
second question.
Yeah, Scandinavia is fine. Yeah.
Is Gunera high in oxalic acid like rhubarbs? Do you know?
No, it's lower. It does contain some. Oxalic acid isn't as big a problem as is often said. Yeah, there's not really any time here, but there's a very good essay by a North American forager, John Callas, in a book, I think it's called Edible Wild Plants, which you can read online, on the myth of oxalic acid. So don't worry about oxalic. In rhubarb, it's actually a different chemical which you find in the leaves, which is the problem, not oxalic acid. So yeah. North America, I've just chosen 2 plants in North America. I could have chosen 30, but this is my favorite, probably my favorite allium if I was asked. This is an allium I call the Chicago onion, because the city of Chicago was actually, the name Chicago means actually stinky old place, or a place where the onions grew in Native American. And Chicago was built on an area where there were huge amounts of onions originally. So it's quite a nice story, so we tend to call it the Chicago onion. And the onion garden at the Botanical Garden in Trondheim, we're now calling the Chicago Garden, the Chicago Onion Garden. Also called nodding onion, prairie lurk in both the Norwegian and Swedish. And it's a plant which is extremely hardy. So it tolerates anything in Scandinavia. It is beautiful to look at. There are many different varieties. It's the most widespread allium in North America. You can use the whole plant. You can also use the flowers in salads. You'll see them in many of my salads. And was also an important food plant for the Native Americans and also for the Europeans. When they arrived, they learned from the natives, and this was really important survival food. In fact, this is one of the few plants you can harvest even in winter in my climate. If you can find the plants under the snow, they stay green all winter. Extremely hardy. And I can almost see this as supermarket food in the future. It's an onion which grows really quickly as well. So instead of growing what we call spring onions or voorlurk, we could be growing perennial Chicago onions. The second one from North America is what we call Indian salad in English, or in America, or the Virginia waterleaf in this case. It's a genus of, I think, 6 or 7 different species, Hydrophyllum, which literally means waterleaf, which are ground covering plants in deciduous forests in this case, eastern North America, which were used, or the young leaves were collected in the springtime by the Native Americans and used as a kind of a salad crop. Again, this was learnt by the Europeans and became a popular food as well. And they're rather pretty, a good ground cover for a forest garden then. I really love these plants. This is from the Botanical Garden in Gothenburg. This is the first time, I've only shown this one a couple of times in my talks. Rudbeckia laciniata is a very popular ornamental plant here in Norway, and I'm sure it is in Sweden as well. And particularly the double form, Rudbeckia laciniata. In North America, this was a very important Native American vegetable in the springtime. In fact, it's called Appalachian greens or Cherokee greens. I kind of missed this one when up until the time I wrote my book. But thanks to a book by one of my favorite foraging authors is Samuel Thayer in North America. He's written 3 amazing books about wild food. And this is in one of his books, and he waxes eloquent about it. This is one of his favorite springtime vegetables, and I couldn't really believe this. So I already had a plant in my garden. It's one of these ones that I hadn't dared to try because I thought it looked a bit poisonous. So I was really surprised last spring when I finally got round to trying it. He was absolutely right. Harvested it in the early spring. This is in May in my garden, and it was really a delicious vegetable here with ostrich fern, fiddleheads, also from eastern North America. Scandinavia, just a few plants from Scandinavia. I think I have to go a little bit quicker now. Just show you a bit of the diversity. Kvann is probably the most important wild plant in Norwegian history. Very important food plant for the Sami people, the Laplanders. Harvested in the springtime as an eaten raw or also fermented for use later in the winter. And in Norway, we have a special variety called Vossekvann from the mountain village of Voss angelica, which has it's a form that was cultivated right up until fairly recently on mountain farms as a vegetable, and it has almost filled stems, so there's very little hole in the middle, and probably because the plant is producing the same amounts of bitter substances spread over a bigger volume of flesh, that it tastes actually sweeter to us, less strong tasting. And thanks to and there are many species of angelica around the world, and wherever angelica grows, people used these plants for food. One of the most popular ornamental ones is the Korean angelica, Angelica gigas, sometimes called, in Norwegian it's called rødkvann, red angelica. And I lead the Norwegian Seed Saver organization, and we've adopted the name Kvann. The letters Kvann stand for knowledge and protection of Norwegian useful plants. Kunnskap og vern av nytteplanter i Norge. And I just mentioned this because our organization, we put out a yearbook every year. In fact, I'm in the middle of editing this yearbook, and it's probably the best source for seed of some of the more unusual perennial vegetables that you're hearing about this evening. And anybody's welcome to join, although the catalogue is mainly in Norwegian. We have some English text and obviously Latin as well, so foreigners manage to negotiate their way through it. So welcome if anybody's interested in joining. Another important Sami Lapland vegetable, particularly in the southern Sami people in Norway, they use this one, the giant bellflower, Campanula latifolia, part of a large family of largely edible plants. Many of them are too small really to bother with, but in particular the larger plants such as this one here are delicious spring vegetables. You can use the flowers, and in the case of this one here you can also use the roots, which are really big and sweet tasting. Giant bellflower. Just a few other plants in the bellflower family. This one is mainly further south in Europe, in the Alps, etc. Usually cooked because it's a bit more hairy than the other ones. And the phytomas, the rampions, spiked rampion, and in Japan we have the balloon flower, which is an important perennial root crop in the Far East, which we can also grow. I've included this onion, also one of my favorites, Allium victorialis, victory onion, in the Norway section of the talk, basically because there's an interesting story associated with this, because this isn't a native plant here. It grows in the wild from the Pyrenees, in the Alps, it grows in the Caucasus, it grows in Siberia, and it's also found in the Far East, in Japan in particular, where they grow it as a field vegetable. And you find it in all the supermarkets. But in the Lofoten Islands in Norway, this plant you find large amounts of it. It seems to have domesticated from some introduction in the past, and you'll even see it being grown as an ornamental in people's gardens here along a driveway to somebody's house. And up until about 10, 15 years ago, people didn't even know this was an onion. They just grew it. They'd always grown it. So when they were told that this was a really fantastic food plant and it's an onion, then they understood why it smelled of onions when they cut the grass next to the plants, because the seeds were falling into the grass all the time and growing up. Some scientists think that, and it's a believable idea, that this was a plant that the Vikings actually introduced to the Lofoten Islands, because this particular island was an important Viking stronghold where you'll find a big Viking museum today. And they've actually made a reconstruction of a Viking onion garden. We know that the Vikings grew onions, but we don't know which species they grew. Probably they grew several different species. And it's nice to think that they actually grew this victory onion as well, which has been planted in this garden. In Japan, you find the young shoots of this onion in supermarkets, and there are huge amounts in northern Norway. Yeah, I think we'll hop over nettles. Important to know that when you're eating nettles in the springtime, you're part of a global movement of nettle eaters, because practically every country in the world has a local species of urtica or nettle. Even some African countries, there's a species Urtica maasai from Africa. And there's the death nettle for New Zealand, Urtica ferox, that people have died from. You can see these are pretty vicious. If they've been out in the bush and fall into some of these plants and they're a long way from help, then there have been some deaths associated with it. But it's actually edible as well, if you dare. Death nettle. Dandelions as well, of course. I love my dandelions, and I class them as edimentals as well, edible ornamentals. And there's a huge, I have something like 30, 35 different types of taraxacum or dandelions growing in my garden. There's the beautiful pink flowered dandelion, the red leaf dandelion. There are many white flowered dandelions. And you could eat a whole dinner of dandelions. You can use the young shoots in the springtime. Here they've been blanched under a pot, like they're done like is the case in France, where they have big greenhouses full of dandelions for blanching in the springtime, sold on markets. You can use the dandelion shoots, the dandelion flower shoots. If you just boil them very quickly and add a bit of butter, you get something we call dandy noodles, or løvenudler in Norwegian. Kids love this. And then you've got the dandy chokes, which is the equivalent of artichokes. It's the underneath the flower in the very early spring when the flower appears at ground level. You can dig down and there's part of the leaves which are naturally blanched because they're under the surface. This is the dandy choke. Dandelion tempura. You can have dandelion entertainment. It's the so-called dandy zoo. You can make dandelion wine. You can make dandelion coffee, tea, schnapps. You can ferment the flower buds. You can use the flowers in salads. There's just a huge range of different things you can do with this hugely nutritious plant. And soon you can, after this fantastic dandelion dinner, you can cycle home on tires made of dandelion rubber. And you can read in the book how I played a small role in the development of this, and back in the early 2000s. So I was the only person that could supply seed of a particular species of dandelion, the rubber dandelion. And in the winter at this time, last year, I gave a talk about winter vegetables. at this time of year, and this is from my cellar just last week, my main vegetable this time of year is actually forced dandelion. So I let dandelion grow in my garden. It self-seeds all over the garden, and I just let it grow until they get quite big, and then I harvest the roots in the autumn, move them into the cellar in these large pots. And in particular this year, it's been such a mild winter that the cellar temperature has been higher than normal, and these blanched dandelions have been coming for several weeks. Totally free, nutritious food. Lovage. The trick with lovage again is to blanch, because lovage tends to be quite strong tasting, often used as an ingredient in soups. But you could eat a lot more of it if you blanch it, because it becomes much milder tasting, and then you can use it in salads, mixed salads, and stir fries, etc. And I even sprout the seeds in the winter as a kind of a perennial seed crop. Western and Southern Europe, I've already mentioned sea kale as being my oldest perennial vegetable, 38 years and still growing. Sea kale is often called the king of the vegetables, because aristocracy, the king and queen and lords and ladies this was a very important vegetable for them, and often forced in warmed greenhouses for Christmas dinner. Thomas Jefferson, the American president, this was his favorite vegetable, imported from the UK originally. And a beautiful plant where it flowers. And this is how probably blanching of vegetables originated, because sea kale grows on the outermost coasts of Europe, exposed to wave activity in the winter, and often during the winter the plants would get buried in a layer of seaweed or sand or whatever. And the young shoots that grew up through the layer of seaweed or whatever were naturally blanched. And people discovered that the taste of this blanched sea kale was milder and tastier for them. So people learned from this and actually went down to the beaches and deliberately heaped seaweed or whatever they had available over the plants, and then they come back a month later to harvest this blanched product. So it's not difficult to believe that this is where blanching originates. In the UK, they traditionally use these special pots. If you had a bit of money, they're quite expensive. And
Stephen?
Yeah.
Now we have like 5 minutes before question time.
Okay, we'll just go through a few more here. A few more pictures. Perennial kales are really interesting. Not many people realized until the last 10 years or so that most of our cabbage family, the huge range of vegetables we eat, were originally perennials. And perennials have a big advantage, as I mentioned earlier, that in particular the cabbage family are difficult to grow organically because of the whole range of insects, pests, caterpillar larvae, diamondback moth, and fungal diseases, which attack later in the season. With my perennial kales, they are largely, you can harvest them in the springtime before these attacks start happening. So there's a lot of advantages of using the original perennial plants and maybe developing these further. They can get very big too. Leeks were also originally perennials. There's still a huge range of different leeks, which in different countries from England to Afghanistan, which are just grown locally. There's the Bath asparagus, which is a woodland plant in the Mediterranean countries, uses a kind of asparagus. Asparagus, the word asparagus literally means spring shoot in the original language. There are many plants that are called something or other asparagus in the Mediterranean countries. and these delicious, and these actually turn up in supermarkets in Norway called just asparagus. They seem to have got mixed up at some stage. Even in one of our best known cookbooks, there's a picture of this plant, Bath asparagus, and it's actually this one here, which is just the ordinary asparagus. Sorry, the other way around. A woodland plant, Mediterranean, I've already mentioned the Mediterranean diet and these diverse dishes they made. This was a calzone I made, which you can find the recipe of in my book. It was a calzone made with traditionally with 50 different vegetables. It took me 6 years to make this because I had to grow all these 50 plants so they were available at the same time for making. Scorzonera, one of my favorite perennial vegetables, although if you're growing it for the roots, it's obviously if you harvest the roots then it dies, but everything else on the plant can also be used. You can read more in the books, but my favorite plant is the flowering stem, which is actually sweet tasting, and the flower buds, which are great in stir-fry dishes, and the Scorzonera lettuce in the springtime, and the flowers in salads, and so it goes on. And there are many other relations to this where the whole plant can be used. Artichokes, we know this is one of the few perennials available in our supermarkets, so I won't dwell on that. Cardoons. There's sweet Sicily, which is a great anise tasting herb, which you can use in the springtime. You can use, again, all parts of it. The young seeds are delicious, and the flowers can be used in salads. In the Mediterranean countries, they mix the wild and cultivated herbs, often cooked very quickly, and then stir-fried in olive oil with nowadays chili, and it's just mixed with a scrambled egg, for example. So very simple food, but delicious and also nutritious. And to make a gourmet version, just add a few flowers. Caucasus and West Asia, almost there. Here I've included, this one I haven't really talked about much before. This is what we call Persian shallots. Many of the ornamental onions that we actually cultivate in our gardens as ornamentals, we can buy the bulbs in the autumn to plant, are actually delicious edible onions. And the Persian shallots are a mixture of different species grown in West Asia, in particular in Iran and Turkey and some of these countries, where they cultivate them and also wild harvest the bulbs. And they basically take the bulbs and they're sliced into thin slices and dried. And these dried onions are then sent to Iranian supermarkets actually around the world. So even in Norway, we can buy the sliced, dried Persian shallots. And you could try then growing these in your garden. And they're a beautiful, again, a beautiful combination of food. And in my book, I had a recipe, mast au musir, which is actually basically these dried onions, which are soaked and then mixed with yogurt and a few spices. Again, delicious. Hablitzia tamnoides, yeah, for me, probably the king of the vegetables, which was inspired by Swedish author Lena Israelsson, who I first read about this plant in one of her books back in about 2000. A climbing spinach from the Caucasus, discovered in Scandinavia, hardly known as an edible plant back at home in the Caucasus. You can read a lot more about that in my book, and we also have a Facebook group, Friends of Hablitzia, on fantastic plant that is extremely hardy, it's productive, it's tasty, can be used raw in salads, it can be used throughout the season, the older leaves can be used cooked, etc., etc. Hablitzia tamnoides. Cranberry cordifolia, the heartleaf cranberry, is a relative of the sea kale, ornamental sea kale, if you like. Introduced to Europe as an ornamental in the early 1800s. But again, if it's blanched, it's a delicious and productive perennial vegetable. I think we'll hop over garlic, get to the Himalaya. Allium velicii is known as the Sherpa onion or the Nepal onion, which is really one of my favorite onions. It has a very strange behavior for an onion. First of all, it doesn't appear until the end of May, beginning of June, which I think is because in the Himalaya you get the monsoon rains quite late in the season, and it's remembering those monsoon rains even in Trondheim, where we've got rain all the time. But in any case, it's the young shoots which we use. The Sherpa people in Nepal, they domesticated this and grow it on quite a big scale up in the mountains at 3,000–4,000 meters, and they would then harvest, and they dried the onions and then exported the onions to the markets in the lowlands, in particular, around Kathmandu and places like this. There are also beautiful onions that some ornamental gardeners grow, and a few years ago, or 2 or 3 years ago, there was actually a Nepalese botanist living in Trondheim, and he heard about my garden, that I had plants from all over the world, and he asked if he could come and see my garden. And to his big surprise, here they are. They find this onion growing in my garden. This is the first time they've ever seen it, because they've never been to the high altitudes where it grows in the Himalayas. And they were so pleased to see this plant, which they called Yimu, that they asked if they could come back a couple of weeks later and make me a Nepalese feast from various Nepalese plants that they found in my garden, and that was absolutely delicious. So I'm a lucky man. Siberian onions, we're really right at the end now. Allium nutans and senescens are both fantastic edibles and productive perennial vegetables. And then we have this very special hybrid onion, which was discovered being grown as an ornamental in northern Sweden, known as Norrlandslök, Norrlands onion. A hybrid, it doesn't produce seeds, it's totally sterile, beautiful plant, very productive, could be an important future vegetable, I believe. There was actually a master's thesis written on this plant, finding out the history. And it's a really interesting detective story that this master's student, Eric Duval, found out and documented in his master's thesis. The lilies are also favorites of mine, particularly again because they're woodland plants. They tolerate a lot of shade, and they're important food plants in the Far East. You can both use the petals, and also the lily bulbs are sold in supermarkets, in Asiatic supermarkets. In fact, this one here, this packet here, I bought in a supermarket in Singapore many years ago, and planted a few bulbs at home, and a couple of years later I had this beautiful flower. So it turned out to be totally hardy in Trondheim. Also the martagon lily, which is a perfect source of carbohydrates. You use the lily scales, they're kind of stir-fried as a carbohydrate source in various dishes. And both the martagon lily and the tiger lily are very popular ornamentals in Norwegian and Scandinavian gardens and throughout Europe, I think, that could be used in forest gardens or just in ornamental gardens. So, spring harvested vegetables from my garden in May. Really, it's the springtime, which is the time of plenty. I have far too much food in the spring, but you could ferment it or dry it to store it for later in the season, or you can force them in the winter. As we talked about last time, this was the salad I talked about, my winter record salad. Yeah, I think that's just about it. Again, please get a copy of my book. Here are my various details. Edimentals.com is my website, email, Instagram, and yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. As always, it's very rich as always. And it would have been really nice to just continue for a while, because I know that you could go on for hours. But I have some questions.
Yeah, sure.
And it's good if you try to answer them quite quickly, because there are some, and we have like 10 minutes. But I would like to start with 3 questions in one. That's, are all malvas, alliums, and rudbeckias edible? So it's like, are all malvas? And then, yeah, you know, it's 3 questions in one.
Yeah, I think alliums, I think you can use any allium that you think tastes good. That's the basic answer there. And none of them are toxic, but if you eat a lot of alliums, then you can get a bad stomach from it, that kind of thing. Malvas, the Malva genus, they are all edible. There are some toxic plants in the mallow family, the Malvaceae, but malvas are basically all edible. Yeah, and the third one was Rudbeckia. I would only eat the Rudbeckia laciniata, which I talked about. The other ones do contain some bitter tasting compounds. So probably they're just not good tasting rather than toxic, but I'm not too sure. More research is needed.
Thank you. And then I have another question also about toxicity. Can hostas, can they pick up toxins from the soil that are not yet bioremediated properly? Do you know?
No, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But, yeah, probably.
So then we go over to questions around how to find plants. So how to find seeds for Korean aster and Ligularia seeds, and how can you find Ligularia plants in Sweden?
In Sweden, there are a number of perennial edible. I would always recommend you to, if you're buying plants which you're going to eat, then buy those plants from nurseries that are selling edible plants. And there are a number of nurseries which are now set up for selling edible plants in Sweden. There are various Facebook groups on forest gardening, skogsträdgård, or whatever you call them, different perennial permaculture type groups. There's people like Philip Weiss and yeah, a number of other people in Sweden. I couldn't name them all, but I know 4 or 5 small nurseries that are selling some of these things. I've already mentioned that you're welcome to join our Norwegian Seed Saver organisation, where many of these plants are available, in particular Ligularia. There's Aya Noak in that Naturplanteskolen just outside of Copenhagen, which could be is a really good, one of the best ones I've seen. Yeah, I'm doing there's a forest garden in central south Sweden that I'm giving, forgotten the name now, which I'm doing a weekend course in the summer. You can look up on my website my various courses, etc. Was that answering your question? Seeds, yeah, again, Norwegian seeds.
Yes, it was specific about the Korean aster seed and the Ligularia, but I can imagine that that's the places where... Yeah.
Korean aster is in my, I have a bit of difficulty producing seed. It's hardy, but the season is slightly too short for it to produce seed every year. So some years I get good crops, other years I hardly get any. This year I've got a few, but I wouldn't join Norwegian Seed Savers just for Korean aster seed, because there's a big demand for it. Yes.
Okay.
I'm doing my best to spread.
Yeah. I have another bit like seedy question. It's do you have any tips about how to propagate dandelion seeds? And Karin, she especially wonders regarding Japanese dandelion that she has had a hard time to propagate.
Dandelion seed has to be relatively fresh, is my experience. So if it's a year or two old, then it often won't germinate. But they do need, I think many of the species, if not all the species, need cold treatment, so-called stratification. So I've actually already sowed seed of 5 or 6 different dandelions this winter, and they're now out in the garden, going through this natural cold period. So I sow them, and I have a kind of a cold frame out in the garden where the moisture can penetrate into the sowing pots, but the birds and mice can't get to. So I would suggest that possibly is the reason that they haven't germinated, that they need some cold treatment. But I'm not totally. I germinate all my seed outside, so I don't think I've tried dandelion without stratification.
Okay, thank you. And then a question from Sanya. Do you have any list of perennials that could be growing in the cellar? Like, she means then cold and dark in the wintertime, like a list of suitable plants.
Well, you can try anything, actually. There's no, but the best things I would think are plants which come very early in the spring. So, for example, hosta, I don't think would be a very good one to grow in a cellar. Which it depends on the temperature, really. So my cellar can be anything between 2 and 6 degrees centigrade in the early in this time of year. This year it's probably even higher than 6 because we've had such a mild winter. And I think hosta it tends to come quite late in the spring in the garden. It's one of the later perennials to emerge. So it probably needs a bit of a higher temperature. So look at how early plants, go into a botanical garden or something and look how different plants, what time of year they appear. So yeah, we talked a bit about that last year, and you could probably look at the webcast from last year, which is still online, isn't it? I think it's on YouTube, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So then a couple of questions that came in about isn't it less nutrients in blanched vegetables?
That's a question I always get. I really wish I had the answer to that one. I've looked. I haven't managed to find any nutritional analyses. If anybody has that, then please let me know, because that's a question I often get. I assume it could be slightly lower, but maybe vitamin C and things like that. But I really wouldn't worry about it. I don't, as long as you have a diverse diet and you're getting the minerals and things like that from the roots, and yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned about it. If you're eating supermarket food, then be concerned about deficiencies. But if you're eating your own food and perennials, then it kind of balances out. And if you have a wide range of different things, a big diversity, then you cover all your needs, it seems, in some way, I think. Yeah.
So that was all questions for now. And thank you so much again, Stephen. This is just wonderful for plant nerds, as most of us here are, I guess. And I would really recommend your book for you that want to go deeper into this, and also to visit your website, like edimentals.com.
That's correct. Yeah. We also have a Facebook group, Edimentals as well. Edimentals. Yeah.
And also in Swedish, as you mentioned, there's this Facebook group that is called Flerariga grönsaker.
That's
I think,
right.
and something more. But if you search on that, you will find it. And also you mentioned Philip's and Anna's books on also like Flerariga grönsaker and
that's right. They've written an excellent book.
And I know that you have been a great inspiration for them. So it's interesting, like, nice to see how things happen. I think.
Yeah, it goes both ways. So we're all inspired by somebody. I could give a talk about all the people that have inspired me. So so thank you.
So thank you very much also from the Eskilstuna Folk High School 1 year in transition, that group that are also here among all of you that we can't see now, and from the Swedish Transition Network, which is also collaborating together to make this happen. So with that we end, and I think it's exactly 8 o'clock actually. And,
well done.
Yeah, I would love that if we could just turn on everyone's cameras, but sadly we can't do that technical wise. So we are just over 100 people joining this
Nice.
this webinar. Yeah. So with that we close for tonight, and we see you in another place next time.
Yeah. See you next year.
Yeah, next year. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.